Thank you all for coming. Yeah, it's so exciting to be able to talk about Renée's work in the context of this remarkable exhibition with Thiago. I guess to answer that question in part, as Rika was saying, Renée is incredibly site sensitive, and she's always thinking about her work in relationship to a particular place in which it's being shown, both the history of that site and its sort of geographic coordinates, but also the architectural conditions of that particular place. So instead of imposing work in a setting, she's always working with the setting in conversation and relationship to all of the various sort of architectural accents and features that sort of become really a part of the work, and the work sort of also becomes sort of a part of the architecture. And I think that's particularly palpable in this exhibition, because it almost feels like many of these works could have always already been here. They relate both to Brazil, but they sort of articulate the space of the architecture. Maybe just to say a little bit of historical background on Renée and her work in relationship to architecture and site. She's very much so informed by histories of site specificity, coming out of conceptual art of the 60s and 70s, and thinking, artists like Robert Smithson and notions of the site and the non-site, and these ideas of work that can only exist in the place in which they're made. Renée, however, has really, I would say, advanced that idea or distributed that idea in what I would maybe refer to as a diasporic politics of site specificity. She always makes work, whether it's the reconfiguration of an existing work or a new work, in relationship to that site, but that's not a fixed product. She believes that site specificity is accretive, and that the work actually gains and grows in its meaning as it sort of translates itself in various sort of architectural spaces, cultural contexts, and so forth. So its meaning is always in relation, always a larger sort of circulation, a larger constellation, and it carries its prior meaning with it. So to speak a bit about what that means here, in 2015, for instance, Renée Green did a residency in Los Angeles at a R.W. Rudolph Schindler modernist house. And she made this piece over here, for instance, that's referencing this architect's manifesto or his relationship to modern architecture. And one of the things he gets at is sort of how paramount space is as a material for modern architecture, that architects, like their primary medium is space. And in many ways, I think that's also true of Renée, that she articulates space, not with, say, concrete walls, but, say, these fabric banners, through flows of moving images, through screens, through these sort of decor-like installations that we see in the library that almost, through their use of sort of domestic trappings, sort of almost feel like they're already always a part of the space, as I'm saying. So she's really implicating us in this mise en scène, which is sort of a strategy and a phrase that she uses often in relationship to her work, sort of making the viewer sort of a part of an unfolding drama, sort of making us sort of an investigator in this space and sort of trying to understand the relationships that she's forming and where she might be coming from and the various references and how we're coming to them, which is all a part of the production of the meaning of the work in real time. So there is sort of this stage-like almost quality as this entire architecture is transformed into this interior scene that we're all a part of. And there's many other ways to continue talking about this particular thematic or topic and its various registers in this exhibition, but maybe to open it up, I'm curious to hear from Thiago, who I know has engaged the work previously, how he came to the work and what sort of different perceptions he has now seeing it in the context of this particular house, but also in the context of Brazil more broadly.
Cool. Eu vou falar inglês porque assim acho que a conversa fica mais fluida, mas a gente sabe bem como o trabalho da Renée também é bastante sobre tradução, né? Então eu acho que a gente faremos alguns arranjos caso seja necessário. I was just like giving this sort of like disclaimer. I first encountered Renée's work. I mean, I guess the first moment when I really saw the work was like 3 years ago, and it was like a survey show in Berlin. So, here of course it carries this feeling that it could I mean, it's not a survey, although there are some existing works or works that are older. But that one that I saw 3 years ago, it was really like a survey. Like, I mean, I guess that her first exhibition in that city, in that context, after a while. Like, I mean, maybe it was the first time that a new generation was encountering that work in Berlin. And one of the things that lingered, that stayed in my mind back then, was if that show, if Renée Green's work could be, or how it could be presented in Brazil. Because it was so much about language. It was so much like textual based in a certain sense. And that was the first thing that, that kind of touched me, you know, like, how could this work be presented in a context or in a country where it wouldn't work in English, you know, like, I mean, the encounter with those pieces wouldn't make sense. At that moment, I was not aware about her interest, research, the time she spent in Portugal, for example. I didn't even know that she had, Derek was, is her brother. So it was kind of interesting in not knowing that. Because when I heard that she was going to open a show here, and when Rika told me, you know, we're preparing like a show on René's in São Paulo, I remembered immediately, like, how are they going to do that? You know, like, I mean, it's going to be like too much based on translation. How exactly will she engage with the architecture? I mean, this very specific architecture of like somehow modern architecture here in São Paulo, you know, how she would embrace it. And yesterday, when Jordan and I, we quickly meet to try to, we didn't really rehearse what we're going to tell today, but we just wanted to see if we were on the same page. We were discussing, I mentioned that for me, it felt the way the works are presented here, or the way they install the works here, they feel to create a very smooth choreography. You know, they almost feel like they belong to the space. You know, like, I mean, you don't properly see a strong rupture, or you don't see something that seems to be completely disconnected from the structure, from this infrastructure. And maybe we can even later talk about that, like what it means when you encounter a work, when you encounter an exhibition, that everything flows smoothly. And yeah, I guess that was my first take, you know, this sort of like entry point to her practice and encountering the practice again here. Then I guess continuing in the whole conversation about language and translation, we were talking yesterday about the I don't know if you're all familiar, but Renée spent some time reading Verdades Tropical, Caetano, that is also here. And while reading it, she got quite fascinated in how Caetano would present some names from pop culture, especially like black US American musicians or artists. How those people were kind of fundamental to his thinking, to the way he would understand, like to create like an aesthetic form. And she would take notes, you know. So she was reading the book, but at the same time she would also take notes and create like some sort of like a parallel index, you know. And so at the same time there was his own index in the book, she would create her own personal index. And now I kind of get the question back to you. How did you encounter the work here in this context, in this like new version of the work, in this translated version of the work as well?
Yeah, so translation, I think, is sort of a key concept or even a key methodology in the work, maybe not literally in terms of linguistic translation, though often, but also in terms of the translation of a work into a new context and a reconfiguration for that particular space and time. And of course, The space poems here were translated for this context into Portuguese. So that's one element of translation. But there's another element in which the work, as I was saying before, gains a new sort of set of meanings and relations. In particular, there's a sense of site serendipity, I would almost call it, because bringing the coming here and spending time here, which is a part of Renée's practice. She doesn't just, do an exhibition, want to show works, put it in this place. She goes and spends, a considerable amount of time and duration to understand a place and to have her own sort of embodied relationship to it, just to be with it and to sense it. And in her time here, of course, she learned that this particular building, which was built by Giancarlo Gasparini between the years of 57 and 59, 1959 also serendipitously coincides with her date of birth. And that, of course, adds a whole different layer of meaning to this piece, which is dated 2024 now because it's this new iteration in Portuguese, but the piece was actually originally made some years prior, again, for the Schindler House, and was mapping these years that sort of begin in 1887 with the birth date of Rudolf Schindler, and then go into his death date, and then then the next date is 1959. So that 1959 also now has a different relationship to this site, and also, of course, brings Renée back into the picture again. So I think when I came to see this exhibition, I was, as I always am, I think, with Renée's work, sort of fascinated with these extra layers, thinking about how the work could be seen differently in this space, thinking about how she might have seen the work differently in this space. As you may have noticed, like nothing about Renée's work, no matter, it's so capacious in terms of the amount of information, the amount of references, the amount of figures, but it doesn't necessarily give itself away either. There's not any sort of singular takeaway or like a singular meaning that you're like, oh, okay, now I get this thing. But rather, it's always an invitation or an interface to understand sort of a broader set of possibilities of your relationship with the thing you're looking at, the space that you're in, and the histories that might have informed it, and your own sort of thinking. So much of the work is about memory, and in that regard, thinking about memory, a lot of her work is about an idea of return, returning to certain figures, returning to certain sites or places. But this idea of return doesn't necessarily even need to be in relationship to a narrative timeline, because in many ways, Renée's relationship to Brazil and this exhibition was almost presaged or inevitable. Renée talks a lot about this idea of inevitable distances. A lot of the work has to do with distance, but also contact. So in a way, via her brother and her personal relationships to Brazil, her own fascinations with Brazil from a young age, her influence by neo-concrete artists like Ligia Clark and Oiticica, which I could speak a bit more later, which informs some of the work she's doing at Dia Beacon next year. But all of these various touch points, be it Caetano Veloso and thinking about the index and sort of thinking about Trans-America flows of music and popular culture in the African diaspora. All of these various sort of entry points populate the relationship to this particular space, but never sort of saying it's sort of this thing or the other. The work also has this sense of ambivalence, in the sense of also calling into our minds all these histories of violence and colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade, but doing so in a way via this decor, this upholstery and this furniture and this wallpaper that just sort of fades into the existing architecture and sort of almost speaks to the innocuous ways in which all of these horrific histories are also so much also still in the present, things that are sort of hiding in plain sight, asking us to look deeper, to look more closely, to think about, the index. What am I reading, but what does that actually reference, and why is that being referenced? Thinking about various architectures of the production of knowledge, linguistic, physical, and otherwise. We were talking a little bit too about, and talking about sort of how I was coming to the work here. One of the themes that are really core to the project that I'm working with Renée on for next year at Dia Beacon is her relationship to color, which for her is partially informed by her relationship to Brazil and thinking about the use of very vibrant colors and textiles in the work of, say, Heliotesica and Espringolese, and thinking about these inhabitable sculptural forms, and thinking about Ligia Clark and this idea of this idea of beat shows and sort of rearrangeable structures, sort of the idea of interaction and the idea that a form is never fixed but always these hinges that can allow something to take on new shapes, which I think relates so much to how she thinks about her own work as this recombinant sort of structure, this sort of iterable structure, but also how she thinks about identity as something that is constantly in development and motion and relation. So I'd be curious for you to talk a little bit if you see any of these sort of references in terms of the chromatic and the chromatic intensities and so forth.
We also started this conversation before, but in a certain sense, when you asked me if I immediately see this or if I see this chromatic reference, I didn't. You know, I wasn't properly. I mean, the color or was not the first element that came. You know, that like highlighted my eyes. You know, I would say that the language was number one.
No.
You know, like I mean, it was the first one that really overwhelmed me. That really caught my attention. That really caught my eyes. And how she really managed to find this smooth transition into one language and another, or maybe like mirror, maybe more than transition, a mirror between both languages, because especially because
in the room there.
yeah, and I guess like I guess she's quite familiar with the language, but she doesn't speak it properly, and so I think it was really this exercise of trying to mirror how how she could use it as like a tool, you know. But I wanted again to go back to the whole conversation about like relations and to the recurring methods, or how some things keep happening or keep reappearing in her work, almost like a loop. Although I don't think she used this word or this term, but she also had like a very beautiful conversation with Pedro like a few weeks ago, and he's also here, and she also mentioned it or put that in a very beautiful way, you know. So can we maybe?
Yeah, and I like this idea of the mirroring, you know, because it is a very beautiful spatial and formal decision in the library to have both the English version of this new space poem about the creator has moved, in direct sort of dialogue, opposition, reference, relationship with its Portuguese translation. So this sense of simultaneity of looking at the English, looking at the Portuguese. Of course, I don't speak or read Portuguese, so I have to there's a sense of suspension of disbelief if this is actually the translation or not. But also, you know, this idea of like these subtle differences and sort of the gaps, the slippages, the spaces in between, these distances, and what does that do in terms of our comprehension, our understanding? This idea that we're literally translating as we move our heads left to right, our bodies are perceiving and sort of performing this act of translation, whether it's literal, as you could read it, or if it's imagined in my own projection. And again, this idea of color, I'm like, you know, creating these chromatic relationships that may or may not be there. I think a lot of her relationship to certain sites, including Brazil up until a certain point, were imagined or projected. And she's interested in how do we see our relationship to spaces, to places we have not necessarily been to, and how are those formed? Oftentimes it's through books, through literature, which we see in many of the moving image works. You know, she almost uses books as interfaces, as ways, as portals to sort of transport herself into different sorts of places, to have sort of different perceptions of places she has not necessarily been, to understand those cultural contexts better. But again, this idea of iteration is a core principle in the practice. The work is deeply recursive. She's constantly looking back in order to make new work. Particularly, I would say, when I came to this exhibition, you know, there's the work with the commemorative toile, which maybe just to give a bit of background on that piece. It's something she's returned to over the course of over almost 35 years now. She first began her conception of this work of using toile in 1991 when she was doing a residency in Clisson, France. And where she was staying, she noticed this toile, this like toile upholstered furniture, and began to think about and imagine, you know, like what is the history of this material, this bucolic, pastoral vignettes, this very idyllic sort of scenery on this fabric. She began to research and understand that, it was originally sort of produced and imported from Southeast Asia in the 17th century, and then went on to be something that was very much so implicated materially in its production in the transatlantic slave trade in France, or France's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade in the Caribbean and so forth. So she originally made an installation as the culmination of that residency that used toile, but just a regular toile, that one would find. And then later, she returned to this idea when she had the opportunity to do a residency in Philadelphia at the Fabric Workshop. And that's when she first made, between 1992 and 93, the commemorative toile, in which she imbued sort of these horrific scenes of slavery and slave uprisings, including the Haitian Revolution, into the fabric subtly. And then since then, she has redeployed this fabric in multimedia installations and shop windows. It's sort of toured Europe, the Americas, and it's occupied, architecture, furniture, and even bodies. So it itself has had its own sort of diasporic, lifespan, and has sort of found its way into Brazil. And actually, for the first time here, speaking to this idea of, her relationship to site specificity in sort of a particular place, because of the modernist architectural origins of this building, she decided to upholster the furniture, rather than using period furniture, say 18th century furniture, she's using mid-20th century furniture, but not like Lina Bavardi or anything so specific. Again, sort of this much more ambivalent or ambiguous idea of sort of any type of mid-20th century furniture that could occupy any of our homes potentially. So that was just a bit to sort of emphasize how much all of Renée's work has its own specific genealogies and version histories. And she's very much so interested in this idea of genealogy, of how things always have an origin, and how these origins can also have ruptures and can create continuities, but also something that is actually a complete sort of pivot, if you will, sort of something that creates a different sort of possibility or a different trajectory within the work.
There's something that you mentioned, again, I guess, in this conversation with Pedro, and it was interesting when you said that, that she's been looking to this film, or she has been looking to older works and trying to reimagine how to represent them. That when I guess she only was able to read Glissant recently. Well, not recently, but Glissant, especially Poetics of Relation, has only been translated into English, I guess, late in the 90s. Although it was published perhaps, I don't know, late in the 80s, mid 90s, early 90s. It was only translated into English late in the 90s. In that book, or those writings, they only reached her perhaps 10 years later. And so when she encountered that material, the first thing that she did was, okay, what was I doing late in the 90s?
Exactly. Yeah.
And how exactly my thinking, how exactly my practice was or wasn't in conversation with what Glissant was proposing late in the 90s. Although, of course, her thinking travels way longer, but it was interesting for me to hear how she did this exercise of returning.
So again, this idea of return is so important to her, physically but also discursively, and she's also interested in these contingencies, both real and imagined. So it's like, okay, where was I in the 90s? Where was I in that moment? What was I reading? Let me return to what I was reading. And how did that relate to thinking about her own discursive formation in any given moment and how that might inform a new production in this current moment. So there are these sort of delays and both real and imagined delays that sort of set up different kinds of conditions and possibility in the present that are always informed by the past. But in that way, I think it's also interesting, and I want to evoke this idea of presence and absence, which I think is so fundamental in her work, because Renée is always present, but she's also incredibly withdrawn or sort of not there. For instance, in all of these works that are around us, she's speaking to us, but through the words of others. There's sort of this ventriloquizing through citation, through fragmented excerpting of particular voices and sort of re-enunciating them in the room, but by virtue, of course, of her own affinities to this text, her own affinities to these words. So this sort of idea of reading and selecting and citing, there's an element of her own style, an element of her own sensibility that is then re-articulated in what seems like, I would say, through sort of these distant words of others. But in this particular iteration, I think it's quite beautiful because we do get her voice, almost this sort of specter of Renée Green through the Vanished Garden sound piece that's not on right now because we're having a conversation. But it actually also has this double effect of bridging the indoors and the outdoors, which I think is also, and this is my own projection from my very little time spent in Brazil, but the architecture I feel like is always somehow both interior and exterior. Mm-hmm. There's like a real relationship between the outdoors and the indoors, and I feel like she's so sensitively in her redeployment of this Vanished Gardens piece, where she's sort of whispering the names of these vanished gardens, it sort of becomes this specter in the entire exhibition, similar to when you're entering the space, hearing this idea of begin again, as spoken by her brother, and then reading the space poem to see it, as the last sort of text there. So there are these echoes, both these reverberations, both sonically and textually and otherwise that, I think are interesting, both in terms of the idea of iteration, but both also in this idea in which Renée is always present, but ambivalent and a bit removed, but there's also this sense of a real sensitivity and sensuality in the ways in which she does show up.
Has she, do you think she works with the notions of like intimacy, proximity?
Oh, totally, yeah.
Yeah, how so?
It's interesting because it's like, I feel like the work is incredibly intimate. Again, I think she feels, I think for her, the idea of reading and making contact with like one idea of making contact with Brazil for her was to read this book. And that's also a way of making intimate contact for her, I think a material contact with this person, with this figure, with his relations, with that discursive network, with that aesthetic world, with that, with those possibilities. So I think there's an intimacy that she sees, a contact that she sees, a possibility of contact at a remove. And that there's something sensual and intimate about becoming closer to a thing, a person, an idea, a place, by virtue of its material remnants, its material culture, its tactility, in terms of the page and so forth. So I think it's not necessarily, it's incredibly sensual, but it's not because of like an evocation of like the body or sort of proximity in terms of physical, of like two bodies touching, that type of proximity, or even being in the same room, but a proximity in terms of projected senses of desire and a possibility of contact, even if via an object interface, or discursive sort of interface. Well, I mean, maybe this is a good moment to open it up to questions. I mean, I feel like there's like an infinite amount of things to discuss in these works, but we're very curious to hear if anyone here has any questions, comments, statements.
Yeah, especially because in certain sense what we're trying to do is to really talk about the work, not really present or introduce the work, but like, I mean, just two people who come from two different perspectives and look and access the work from different contexts, rather than like, I mean, I don't know, like a lecture. We're definitely not trying to do that, but it's more like now that I guess that we warmed up, perhaps we can open up a bit.
Well, I would like you to talk a little bit more about the importance of the sound in Renée's work, and also the relation of the sound with the architecture in the ways you see it.
Yeah, so I think as I was saying, I think in this particular instance, there is sort of the spectral quality of the sound and this almost intentional sort of sound bleed. You hear something before you see it. You're welcomed by sound. Sound is, of course, disembodied. There's voices, but they're untethered. We may not know that it's Derek Green speaking to us. We maybe learn that later. So again, there's this idea of like a partial reveal that sort of, then gains a little bit more of a substance or a bit more of an anchoring or a tethering in other media forms. But also I think sound for her is an element of allure. It's something that can choreograph you, that brings you in. It modulates your body and sort of your expectations, or like something is around the corner. It has a relationship to the flows of bodies. So I think she thinks a lot about that as well, in terms of thinking about sound as a strategy, a spatial strategy, in addition to, of course, the content of the work itself, which is almost always already remediated into a different sort of form as well. So it's never just the sound. It's always, the sound is somehow always related to another body as well, another medium, another mode of articulating that concept or idea. So there's a sense of its fugitivity in that regard, I would say.
I think it's very relevant, the presentation of this exhibition in Brazil. Renée belongs to a generation of artists who reopened the box of conceptual art and reinvented ways of doing conceptual art, tuning it with subjects and with ideas from their own generation. In some way there was not this idea of avant-garde that existed in the 60s, 70s, movement of new conceptual art, but there was a new way of to address language, space, architecture, not wanting to do tabula rasa from the past, but using history and the past as a new way of doing art too.
Yeah.
And it's very curious because in Brazil, even if there were some of the most radical chapters of conceptual experiments happening in Brazilian art in the past, they're very little recognized today. Even, for example, generation of Hélio, Wojtysica, or Clark, or Pape are more popular in terms of abstraction than in terms of conceptual challenges they brought into the art field. And this originated a sort of mannerism.
Yeah.
And what is very curious is the way Renée resists to the mannerism, because she's a witness of this mannerism where the art market appropriates conceptual languages too. And this is why it is so brave, the persistence and the coherence of her work, and why it is so important to present it and to discuss it in a country like Brazil with its sound history, and also with a different way how to interpret a different history. Because it's very curious, you are mentioning the relevance of Verdade Tropical to Renée. But when she was here, we were discussing about the need of a new bibliography in terms of knowledge of what happened in Brazil. Because what happened in Brazil in terms of the history of quilombos, for example, in terms of independent and radical ideas of society developed by the black cultures surviving in Brazil to a genocide of 5 centuries, it's very peculiar, very different of the history of the black presence in the United States. There is a common branch, and after there are total radical branches, but in far away, according to the history of colonialism too, this tree. And this is why I think it's really very curious to reopen the box and to open a discussion where conceptual language, when the use of the language in art, can be also be rediscussed in a country where, for maybe conceptual art started with Mestre Didi, for example.
No, I
guess,
think. Oh, please. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I was going to say that. No, yesterday when we were talking about Verdade Tropical, I don't remember in details how we were talking about it, but we talked about Caetano, we talked about Verdade Tropical, and then we discussed how it is, of course, it is an image of Brazil as important or as authentic as several other images, but it also belongs to another moment, let's say, like it's an image that belongs perhaps to the 20th century. And so when she encounters this book, and saying that it belongs to the 20th century doesn't mean that it's no longer true or authentic. It's just, it belongs to a different moment. And we were discussing that, you know, like, I mean, that it's also quite telling that in her encounter with language, with pop culture or popular culture in Brazil, this book, that text was the one that was his entry point, and how in a certain sense this also create like a path, a very specific path for her to encounter or to think about the culture or arts and culture that have been produced in this territory, you know, and so it's quite telling. But this also, again, I mean, in a certain sense, this conversation it's surrounding more about language than I previously imagined, because when you say about like Black radical texts or Black radical traditions in Brazil, they were producing or they were writing, they were articulating themselves at the same time as other artists from Caetano Veloso generation, but at the same time they haven't been properly translated into English, you know, and so this is another conversation, you know, and so she was able to access, of course, this text is quite recent, you know, it's like 20 years old, but she was able to access that through the possibilities of translation, and so it goes directly perhaps to what you mentioned that you talked with her, the necessity, of course, to encounter a new bibliography, but this bibliography already exists. It's more about how to make it accessible in different languages or in different sources, let's say. And maybe you can just continue because I just jumped in you.
Yeah, no, I mean, you put a lot out there that I think is very resonant. For one, yes, Renée, from the very beginning, has been returning to the 60s and the 70s as something that is far from exhausted in terms of a generation or even understood. So I think a lot of this active return is also an unearthing, but also a reanimation and also a questioning, keeping the ground sort of fertile and not letting it sort of cement in terms of our imagined understandings of what this period is in terms of nostalgia and otherwise, but this idea of, say, Veloso being, say, a figure of the 20th century, not the 21st, I think is true, and for Renée would probably be true as well, but she's also interested in what does it mean then to think about, you know, I think this is sort of an object of history, this book, this idea, this notion of this person at this particular time, this particular radicality, and so forth. So what sort of conditions of possibilities were at that moment or can be understood through this text, through this object, and what does that mean today? Like, what does that mean in relationship to what are the possibilities of radicality today? So I think it's always a both and, sort of a return as a proposition in the present, both this idea of that particular moment not being sort of fixed or understood and in terms of who the players are, what sort of the history, you know, like not allowing that to ferment, if you will, but also allowing that to be a provocation, I think is really essential to her work. You know, conceptualism, or at least Western conceptual art, was incredibly formative for her. As early as her undergraduate years, she studied at Wesleyan University in the late 70s, graduated in the early 80s. And her first published writings were as an undergraduate, surrounding an exhibition of the artist Solowit's collection that was going on view at Wesleyan. And she penned text at this young age on Lawrence Weiner and Adrian Piper and Sylvia Plath McMangold. So this has been an enduring interest in her work. And in terms of what actually Thiago was saying earlier in terms of her returning to periods of time in what she was reading, etc., she's constantly been returning to that moment and thinking about her own intellectual formation and what were the conditions in which that was, you know, the knowledge in which she inherited and how she's metabolized and remetabolized and rearticulated that in various spaces and contexts and began to broaden the reference points and her understandings of this very generative moment of the 60s and 70s. And as you're saying, she was actually a part of a generation of artists in the 90s who were technically the first generation of artists to like inherit conceptual art as a historical movement. So that idea of historicization, periodization is something she also questions, both, in terms of something that's productive in the sense of indexing and sort of creating structures of knowledge and understanding how history is constructed, but also the very fiction or the artificiality of the exercise of history in the first place. So questioning, as you're saying, well, what is the 60s in Brazil? What does that even mean? When we begin to rely on a retrospective gaze, which she's constantly rupturing in the present and making us understand that we're thinking retrospectively, which is always a flawed memory, and how that sort of rubs up against ideas of public record, public recollection, and so forth.
Yeah, I think also in that time of her graduation, she was quite close to Edward Said's idea of beginning. So what do you inherit and how do you move forward? And I somehow, I think I'm going to read a small idea of Said's, who is a Palestinian critic, and I think it's quite something that we should think about at this moment. If there is some especially urgent claim to be made for criticism, it is in that constant re-experiencing of beginning and beginning again, whose force is to stimulate self-conscious and situated activity. Eu vou ler em português. Se há alguma reivindicação especialmente urgente a ser feita para a crítica, é naquela constante revivência do começo e do recomeço, cuja força é estimular a atividade autoconsciente situada. If you can comment on René's relation to this author.
Yeah, I think begin again, which of course in itself is echoed throughout this exhibition and throughout her practice. The very idea of iteration, recursivity, return as a productive move, I think that is really an operative strategy in the work. It's really a methodology, it's a way of existing in the world. It's a politics in its own right. I think, we see it in this work, in terms of creating the semblance of a continuous timeline, ruptured by this idea again of after, all of these titles from Muriel Rukeyser's poems that all start with the word after. So it's always sort of this idea of after this thing. So then again, creating these contingencies of a moment and then something that begins. So this idea of beginning, but then always beginning again. So this idea of understanding that time is nonlinear and that productivity is also nonlinear, or this idea that the work is never done, that we're always beginning it, that it's always unfolding. But I think it really is a provocation, to begin again, to continue to reiterate, to recalibrate, to re-strategize, to reconfigure, to recontextualize, to reanimate. All of these re's, it's in her name. Her name is Renée, which also means to be reborn. So it's quite ingrained, I think, in her very DNA, and I think it's something that we can all take into our own daily practices.
I think I had some. I'm going to try to be short, but what I wanted to say, but I wanted to go back to Thiago's question about intimacy and proximity, and just kind of remind everyone that the name of the show is Come Closer, Percepts. And I think that also brings a lot of things into the experience of the show, or what she invites people to experience in the show, which is this act of approximation and re-evaluation of the structures of language, of the structures of architecture. And I think that the show kind of works really nicely around these ideas, but also to the point of translation. I guess there's one thing that's been on my mind a lot, which is in René's practice there's this kind of tension between rigor and ambiguity, and kind of an invitation that the approximation also allows for misreading. Close reading is also misreading a lot of the time, and this is not a bad thing at all. And I've been thinking about like this term that she refers to in her teaching a lot, which is discrepant engagements. She got that from Nathaniel Mackey, the poet. And I think her relationship with translation is also one of discrepant engagements, you know, like, what are the disjunctures that can happen in this action? And you can see this a lot in the show with the mirroring of the banners. You see where things lived, where they didn't really map with each other. Like a big one for me is wildernesses in English, which is translated to desertos in Portuguese. That's an artifact from the translation from Borges from Spanish to English to begin with, you know? So there are all of these little nodes in which you can kind of like have to come closer to engage with, to open, you know? So yeah, I think that was kind of confusing, but yeah.
No, not at all. I think that makes it's beautiful. And again, those slippages, those disjunctures, those moments, those fragmentations, I think she mobilizes them, or she creates the space where those things can transpire, in the fact of taking fragments in the first place and allowing them to become something that floats in space, you know, for us to engage and to re-anchor for ourselves. This idea of come closer is already always an invitation, but perhaps an invitation into that interstitial space, you know, between sort of fidelity and approximation, or as you were sort of getting at.
Great.
De novo, queria agradecer a presença de todas, e Thiago e Jordan. Queria aproveitar e agradecer o Pedro Zilberstein, que fez uma conversa com a Renée, quando a Renée estava aqui montando a exposição. A conversa está publicada no YouTube, então se vocês procurarem Renée Green, Brasil já vai aparecer lá. E o Pedro também ajudou ao longo do processo de traduções e tal, foi uma figura muito presente. O Pedro foi aluno da Renée de 2016 a 2018, a Renée foi a orientadora dele, e o Pedro tem uma intimidade muito grande com o trabalho. E aí eu queria aproveitar e convidar a Lidiane Maciel, que trouxe hoje um grupo de doutorandos para ver a exposição. A Lidiane teve contato recentemente com o trabalho da Renée, e, enfim, queria passar um pouco a palavra para a Lidiane.
Desculpas, mas sorry, vou falar em português. É uma experiência muito... bastante difícil estar aqui nesse lugar. Eu dou aula há 15 anos de antropologia social, e o meu encontro com a Renée Green foi por meio da obra O Local da Cultura, do Homi Bhabha. E eu estava preparando uma aula do Homi Bhabha, e ele cita a importância da arte para a composição do debate justamente dos entre-lugares, né? E aí eu estou lá preparando a aula, encontrei uma referência dela na internet, e é claro que a relação dela com o Brasil e o Derek é uma das informações que o Google nos dá de imediato. É incrível o poder da fofoca aqui. E eu estou aqui com alguns alunos e nós... será que isso é verdade mesmo? Peraí, né? Ficamos, né, tentando verificar se o nome estava correto. E aí eu falei, não, acho que é isso mesmo. E aí, lendo um pouco sobre a galeria, eu vi que ela estava com exposição aqui e entendi, né, a importância da obra dela no sentido do mundo das artes, né? Mas eu acho que vai muito além, né? Eu acho que a importância do trabalho em antropologia social que ela faz, sociologia, o trabalho dessa vinculação com a arquitetura. Os meus alunos são de planejamento urbano e regional, e todo mundo nos perguntam por que uma exposição de arte, ou por que a gente ter um apelo, né, vinculado à antropologia social nesse curso, né? E eu sou uma das defensoras do lugar da cultura como fundamental para trabalhar os lugares, né? Os lugares eles surgem a partir de ideias. Então, quais são as ideias que hoje nós estamos ensinando nos nossos diferentes cursos de arquitetura e urbanismo e de planejamento da cidade, né? Então, acho que esse encontro com a Renée Green, ele é, assim, muito importante para mim, porque, né, já tenho um caminho aí de 20 anos na área, mas nunca tinha firmado aí esse pé nas artes para ensinar outras disciplinas. Então, quando a gente acompanha, principalmente a sala que mais me toca, que é a sala biblioteca, né? Evidentemente a biblioteca é um pouco o ambiente nosso, né, da intelectualidade, então tem esse ar encantador. E eu ofereci aos meus alunos, eles não estão aqui, né, não sei, podem me contrariar, mas a experiência da aula foi muito motivada pela experiência da própria biblioteca, né, da ideia da distância e da aproximação, muito, né, movida pelo conceito de Perceptos, que a Renée vai trazer a partir da... Já estou falando Renée, né? A Renée Green trabalha com uma filosofia que me agrada muito, que é a do Deleuze do Guattari. E o que é filosofia é um texto fundamental nas nossas disciplinas, né? E como ela captura essa ideia de percepto, trazendo a gente para esses entre-lugares que o Homi Bhabha trabalha na obra dele. Então, a experiência foi a seguinte, né? Foi justamente apresentar a sala, uma fotografia da sala, e aí um encantamento, né? Nossa, eu passaria a tarde inteira nesta sala, fazendo leituras, estudos, e aí a gente começa a se aproximar das imagens. E aí esse movimento do mal-estar estampado no tecido é algo que me provocou, enquanto professora, né, a levar esse outro tipo de experiência para a sala de aula. E claro que assim, né, também me chamou muito a atenção, mas de fato eu que já trabalho um tempo com o urbano, né, a gente pouco para pensar a historicidade que estão debaixo, estão, né, nesses subsolos, e como que há uma conexão com algo que a gente ainda fala hoje de maneira muito presente, que é o colonialismo, né? Então trazer a dimensão de toda a experiência colonial que não está lá atrás, está aqui, né? Então, estando aqui, o que nós fazemos a partir deste reconhecimento, que eu acho que é o desafio para nós humanistas, né, de diferentes áreas, né, como que a gente cria outras possibilidades no agora, né? Então essa ideia do entre lugares, da criatividade da cultura, né, dessa dimensão de todos os símbolos espalhados e o que a gente pode montar a partir disso, eu acho que a Renée Green traz, né, com muita força. Então, eu estou bastante movida a produzir uma pesquisa um pouco mais aprofundada, científica da obra dela e da potencialidade para os estudos do urbano. Então, um pouco isso. Eu agradeço demais o Ricardo pela acolhida, desde o primeiro momento que eu cheguei aqui meio perdida, né, Ricardo, tentando entender, né, e eu acho que esses 2 meses, né, quase 2 meses, foram meses assim muito significativos para mim, enquanto também pesquisadora, né, de entender esses subsolos e essas camadas que nos unem, né, na verdade elas nos unem. Todos nós temos ainda responsabilidades, né, com esse cotidiano caótico, maluco das nossas cidades, né, por mais que a gente não se veja como responsáveis, né. Então, de fato, eu acredito que a exposição, a obra da Renée Green, ela, de fato, cumpre esse lugar de nos levar para esses entre-lugares. Então, muito obrigada.